And I guess before we get started, there is this one thing that I kind of want to clarify. It's not going to change anything in the course, but just for your knowledge, with Cogbooks, I did not create the content. So I can't really change the content. I'm going to do my best to help you interpret it and understand it. And if you find any errors in the materials that you think is an error or are blatant errors like typos or calculations that don't seem to make sense, please let me know. I do try to go through all the Cogbooks materials myself, but I'm human and miss stuff too. But if you let me know there's any errors, I can contact the Cogbooks, the creators of the course, and they can fix the course. And if there's any comments that you have at any time that maybe a section is a little vague or a section you think doesn't make a lot of sense or something like that, please let me know. I won't take it personal. This type of feedback is important for the course so that the software side of this, they can improve the content from semester to semester. And so they asked me to ask you for your feedback. So if anytime that comes up in the course, just feel free to let me know, and I can pass the message on to Cogbooks, to the people that actually created the course. And with that, that's really the only announcement, other than remember, exam 2 is on the 6th, I believe, right? That's Tuesday. Yeah, so exam 2 is on the 6th, and I will have another office hours. I'm planning on having one on Monday. So if we don't get through all the questions, and if everybody's not completed with Cogbooks up to this point, that's fine. We'll have another chance to go over some of the materials again before your exam. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the group if anybody has any questions. Specifically, there's a comment in the chat saying, can we go over the questions like last time? Yeah, we can definitely do that. But before we get to those, I just want to make sure if anybody has any specific questions for maybe some of the activities or any of that content from Cogbooks.
The heat flux equations, will those be on the exam? Will we need to have those memorized, or will it be provided for us?
You will have to know the heat flux equations for the exam.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, so one way to study for that is kind of make flashcards maybe, just because you'll have to know them and practice writing them out. And there was a question on the discussion that I kind of wanted to address, unless somebody else has another question real quick. All right, so I'll share my screen. This is from one of the activities from Cogbooks. So can everybody see this activity A about heat flux?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So the question was, how are we supposed to know which is the correct answer when there's possibly multiple forms of heat flux? And I think that's a great question because it's absolutely true. And the way that I would recommend approaching these types of questions, because you will see questions just like this on the exam, is don't think of what is the only absolute correct answer. Look at all of the options and think, what is the best answer given my choices? So for this first one, with the snake right here on the road, what are the types of heat flux going on? We're given choices of radiation, convection, and conduction.
Would it be conduction?
I would argue, well, yeah.
I don't know.
No, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, is I would argue right here that there's obvious evidence of conduction, because conduction involves contact, right? So the snake is in contact with the asphalt. There's also, it's light out, so there's also some solar radiation happening. So the snake is likely on this asphalt because it's warm and it's absorbing heat from the surface by being in contact with it, but it's also absorbing heat via the sun. So, off the bat, I would argue there's evidence for two. Now, convection, that one involves some form of liquid, whether it be air, so the wind, or water. So there's no real evidence of wind or in this picture, like there's nothing blowing and there's no water in the picture. So I would argue convection could probably be ruled out, but there might be radiation and conduction. And if we look at our choices, we see one picture down here with the corals, and that's in water. So I would argue the convection would be that would probably be the top choice there. Maybe it's light out, so there's a little evidence for radiation, but water transfers heat at a really high rate. And then this last picture, if we look at it, we could argue again, it's light out, right? So there's going to be some form of radiation. There's I believe that's a type of bee or a false bee. Actually, I'm not sure. Sorry. It's an insect. Let's call it that. It is in contact with the leaf, but if we had to think about conduction, that has to do with surface area, right? How much contact an organism is in with an object, or how much two objects are in contact with each other. Now, is there a lot of contact between this organism and its surface, the leaf?
Not nearly as much compared to the snake on the asphalt.
Yeah, so that's why I would say the best answer, in my opinion, would be that conduction would be the snake and radiation would be with this insect. And that's, I'm pretty sure, yeah, Cogbooks agrees with that. So does that approach kind of make sense on how to go about these pictures, kind of break them down and then say what is the best answer?
Yeah, can you explain how wings deal with convection? I mean, I'm assuming like they're moving the air around, and
Yeah, so
that has to do with.
Wings have a lot of surface area, not a lot of volume. So if it's windy out, like the wind's blowing, it's going to absorb or lose a lot of heat via convection. But also, like you said, when wings are flapping, they produce their own wind. So therefore, they can lose heat by buzzing.
That makes sense. Thank you.
All right, so there's a question from the chat about T8 optimization. Not positive if this is the one that someone else had. Let me double check on this. So it's 8. Okay, so these are all similar types of questions. But before we get into 2C, I kind of made a little bit of a step-by-step guide for, I believe it is, yeah, it's this one. So these questions are all similar, so this should make sense. We can go over the specific one, 2C and 2B as well. But this question asks, assuming that a female invests 1,000 kilojoules of energy in her eggs, which of the following clutch sizes would best or be closest to the optimum? So the first thing you want to do in this is, where is an important point on this curve that we're looking at?
The tangent.
Yeah, where you would draw a tangent line or the inflection point, right? So where the steepness shifts from being very steep to being less steep. So this general area, right? Where I circled in red. You guys can still see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then from that, you can draw a straight line, and that's the tangent line, exactly what you're saying. And then once we have an estimate of where that tangent line is, you can draw another line that comes straight down from the middle. And then that tells us on the x-axis how much energy they should invest per individual. So that's before we do any math. And then the next step is to actually bring in the math. And that is, we go back to how much energy we were given. So 1,000, that's how much she has to invest in her offspring. And the optimal per individual is 200. So we do 1,000 divided by 200, right? What do we get? Yeah, 5. So 5 offspring. That would be the optimal for this female. And that's the same for the other activities, right? This one is, we have 1,000 kilojoules, again, of energy. And here the tangent line is going to probably be somewhere around here. So, Cogbooks is probably going to have rounder numbers. So we would do 50 and divide 1,000 by 50, and we get our answer of 20. Does that make sense? How we calculate optimal clutch size using these curves? And I don't think Cogbooks, the video talks about this a little bit more, but there's no real written part that explains it in that kind of detail. So that's a fair question too. And I just want to go over another form of the energy flux activity real quick, just to make sure we're on the same page. So for these questions, the first one says here, assume both organisms experience the same body temperature. Which organism will gain more heat by radiation? Explain your rationale. So we have A and B, and we're concerned with radiation. And if they're going to absorb heat by radiation, it's likely going to be from another object or from the sun as a common source. So would A or B likely gain more heat via radiation?
B?
What was that?
Is it B?
Yeah, it's B. And why is that?
More surface area?
Exactly. If you have more surface area, you have more opportunity to absorb more radiation.
And does that work with every heat flux? Like it works with radiation, conduction, convection, right? The more surface area is in contact with, typically it's that one.
Having more surface area is going to allow for more heat flux, because if we look at the equations, this is radiation emitted. It has a surface area component. Conduction has an A for a surface area component. Convection has an A, and evaporation has an A. So yeah, surface area is going to be very important for all of these equations. It's a great point. One that might be a little tricky, where was it? Which I think it was. Or was it? Sorry. There's a specific one I want to go over. I was just the next one. Yeah, so for the turtles, this again is, assuming both organisms experience the same body temperature and environmental temperature, which animal will lose more heat by convection and why? So if we're looking at turtle A is the one down here, and turtle B is the one here. So if they have the same body temperature, which one would lose more heat by convection in this case? The one out of the water mostly, or the one in the water mostly? A, yeah. And why is that? Yeah, more surface area in the water because it's suspended in the water. Exactly. So convection, that's going to be wind or water. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. You could, maybe someone makes the argument, well, this one has more surface area that could be exposed to the wind, or this one has more surface area exposed to the water, but water has a higher heat flux than air. So all things being equal, if you have the same amount of surface area between the two turtles, one's in the water and one's out of the water, the one in the water is going to have more heat flux because, again, water has a higher capacity for heat flux than air. All right, so those are a few of the examples that I wanted to go over. Unless anybody has any other questions specifically, and we can come back to stuff, no problem. Somebody asked earlier if we could go over the topics and learning objectives again. And I think that's a great idea and use of this time, as long as you participate. I'm not going to read all the answers to you, but I will, be happy to facilitate discussion and lead to the right answer. All right, so why don't we go to those questions? The first one says, describe all processes by which organisms exchange heat with their environment. So we've already talked about a few of these, actually probably all of them, but just to go through them, why don't we list off what are the processes?
Radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation.
Yes. And what do we think of, how would we describe radiation? In terms of heat flux? Like, what is the physical mechanism of radiation? How does the heat transfer from one object to another?
The electromagnetic energy from the sun.
That is definitely one form of radiation. Because remember, for heat flux, the organism has to be.
It can bounce off of. It can bounce off of things. Wait, no, that's considered.
I mean, radiation.
Light. I don't know.
I think you're definitely on track. Radiation is a form of energy, and it can bounce off of one object and hit another object. But I guess what I was getting at is, for all of these processes, the organism has to be able to absorb it, heat that this way, and also give off. So we said sun gives off heat, and that's how an organism absorbs it. How does an organism lose heat via radiation?
Thermal radiation? I'm a little confused.
What was the first part you said?
Ready?
Is it when the temperature is not low? Is it when it's lower than the organism? I had trouble with this one. I can't.
No, that's definitely where I was going. Yeah. So I would describe it the same way, but in terms of the organism. So when an organism's body temperature is greater than the surrounding environmental temperature, the organism can physically radiate energy. So I don't know if anybody's had sunburn. When your skin is burned and you feel warm, and when you go inside in air conditioning, you feel really warm, and you can even feel like above your skin. You don't have to make contact. You can feel the heat radiating off of a person. Or if you've ever run a race and gone into an air-conditioned building right away, you've noticed like that person, you can feel the heat coming off of their body. So it's just dissipating energy from your body when your body is warmer than the environment. Yes, the question in the chat was, so when an organism's body temperature is higher than the outdoor temperature, radiation causes a loss of heat. And why do we have heat flux? Why when we're warmer do we dump heat to the environment, and when we're cold, we absorb heat from the environment? What does energy do in an environment? Yeah, homeostasis, it wants to be in equilibrium, exactly. So, if we're the exact temperature of the environment we're in, we'll probably not radiate heat, right? Because we're going to be at equilibrium with our environment. All right, what about the next one? How about conduction? How would we describe energy transfer, heat flux via conduction? What do two objects need to do to transfer heat via conduction?
Be in contact.
Yeah, and be in contact. In the chat, they need to touch, right? So I mean, this could be two rocks, a plant and a rock, an animal, and the surface like soil. So just it needs to be in contact. And again, what needs to be different about those two objects in order to transfer heat?
The temperatures need to be different.
Yeah, one needs to be warmer than the other, right? Or one colder than the other, however you want to describe it. Exactly. They have to have two different temperatures. Because if they're exactly the same, they can touch, but their energies are the same, so they're not going to transfer any heat via conduction. And what about convection? How would we describe that type of heat flux? What needs to be involved there with an object?
Wind or gases or liquid.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be through the wind, or it could be through some type of liquid, typically water, what we think of. And that's why, you know, if we go swimming on a hot summer day, it feels nice because we're losing heat to the water, versus if you work in some sort of steel mill and they heat up the metals, in order to cool them, they dip them in a cooler liquid. Same idea, right? So it's heat transfer. All right, and what about evaporation? How does that work? How do we describe that? So in the chat,
Is
water
that
to gas from heat energy. Go ahead if you want to build on that.
no, that was pretty much it.
So what in humans, how do we physically lose heat via evaporation? What are a couple of ways? So somebody said sweat. What's another way we can lose heat via evaporation? What happens when we run or do a lot of physical activity? Sometimes we pant.
Exhaling.
Yeah, exactly. Breathing itself. I mean, panting is just an elaborated version of that, but breathing in general loses, you know, we can lose heat via evaporation, especially if we're in a cool environment. The question in the chat is, how do we differ convection and evaporation easily? So at least through the activities, if you have any picture where an organism is in water, that's, I would say 100% of the time going to be convection. Wind is a little bit more difficult because you're going to have some visual in the picture that's going to show maybe a bird flying or an insect flying, some sort of wind or like leaves blowing in the background. There's got to be some sort of evidence of wind for being a terrestrial example. And then if we think about evaporation, like we talked about in the pictures, there was a good example where there were horses that were sweating, right? So there's going to be some sort of sweating or an animal that is clearly panting. And this is part of why I say that don't think of these as absolute, because a lot of times when we have heat flux occur, most of the time, all of these processes are going on at once, right? We're not losing heat only one way under a certain condition, unless we're completely submerged underwater. That's closest to the one where we lose the most by a single trait. But oftentimes we're losing heat or giving heat or gaining heat rather through a combination of these. So does that make sense on how to differentiate convection from evaporation? Okay. Well, I think that takes care of number one, unless anybody has any more questions or comments they want to add to it. Not, we can go to number two. This one says, compare processes of heat flux between organisms with different structures, postures, or behaviors. So when we say structures here, what do we think we're talking about?
The organism's functions.
What do you mean by functions?
Like, I know body temperature, when it's colder out, our bodies work slower, like the metabolism, protein building. I don't know if that's the right direction that this question's going, but that's kind of the way I took it, like how the body behaves and maybe their genetics, like how well they work in certain environments.
That's fair, and I can definitely see, I think, where you were going with that. The way I interpret this question is structures would be physical elements, so like a lizard on a rock, or a
Oh, okay. Now I get it. I'm
polar bear.
sorry.
Oh, no, no worries. And also,
That makes more sense.
just to clarify, I didn't write these like learning objectives or topics either. So, this is my interpretation from reading the materials and going over it. So if somebody, has a better answer, I'm, open to suggestions. But when I read structures and from the pictures of the activities, I immediately thought of the lizard on the rock and the polar bear on the ice. So like physical structures that they have to be in contact with, because that can change their amount of heat transfer, especially via which one would we think of if they're in contact with a structure?
So like snakes hang out on rocks during the day to like stay to keep warm because they don't have like a whole lot of, they don't have fur, they don't have, yeah, they can't stay warm any other way. So is that like what it's going at? Like the behavior is that they sit out on the rock to get warm from.
That's the interpretation I got from it. Or another structure
Okay, cool.
related to the snake, if it's too hot, it might go under a tree or under a bush, right? Because that structure provides shade and blocks radiation. So it protects the snake from gaining excessive heat. And when it's cooler, it can provide heat to the snake itself.
I like that way better. Thank you.
And the reason I would think also that it doesn't have to do with the physiology is because when we talk about heat flux, we're not talking about heat produced via metabolism, because that's not really a form of heat flux in the sense that we can only dump heat that way. We don't gain heat via metabolism. And that's why it's not included as one of the heat flux examples that the book goes over.
Okay.
And then the next one talks about postures. How does an organism's posture affect heat flux? What are some examples maybe that an organism does with its posture? So what's something that all four of the forms of heat flux have in common? This one says, like a lizard laying flat for more surface. Exactly, yep. So the surface area is where I was going to get at with this. So an organism can lay flat on a rock to have more contact via convection, right? Or, what some lizards do in the desert is they actually stand on 2 feet at a time, and it prevents them being in contact with the really hot sand, and it pushes them off the ground. So they absorb less heat via conduction as well as less heat via radiation. Yeah, birds oftentimes extend their wings out. They can, increase their surface area, especially if it's like a windy day. If they increase their surface area, they can lose more heat via convection. Or they might do the opposite when it's cold, right? You see birds that, cuddle up into a small ball, and that reduces the surface area and increases their volume, so they lose less heat. So again, think of, it can always go both ways. So we got to think, how they can gain and how they can lose heat too. Those are great examples. And the last
How
one
is this question?
Sorry, go ahead.
How is this question different from the last?
So a structure, that's thinking about.
Oh, it's talking about the equation specifically, is that like the surface area, what you were talking about?
Or this question versus which one?
3 and 2.
Yeah, so the next one is strictly related to the equations.
Okay.
Well, let's finish 2 real quick. So if we think about behaviors, what are some behaviors an organism can do to change the amount of heat flux? Well, I guess we talked about extending the wings. That's a behavior too. So yeah, panting or sweating is another one that leads to evaporation. And then hibernation. Yeah, so going into a shelter, they could seek shade. What do turtles do, or a lot of semi-aquatic animals do when it gets hot out? we do it too, I guess, as humans sometimes.
Get in the water.
Yeah, exactly, go in the water because that has a high ability or high capacity for heat flux via convection, right? Yeah, and then 3 is very related to this, but that's specifically the equations. What are some parameters in the equations that would relate to structure? Yeah, surface area is the first one that comes to mind for me too, because that's in all of the equations. So if they change their surface area, it's going to change the heat flux. And this is going to come from the modeling heat flux part of our cogbooks. I'll open that for us. Yeah, so this is radiation. We've got surface area, and then what is some of these are constants, so not all the parameters are going to be considered, right? Like the Boltzmann's constant, that's never going to change, so we don't really got to worry about that. We just have to kind of know what it is. But what is T here?
Temperature.
Yeah, right. T equals the temperature of an object. So if we think of structures, they might choose to contact structures that are in different or that are at different temperatures. So a question from the chat then is, do we just need to know the variables of the equation or more deep into it? I'd say the conversation we have is probably as deep as you're going to need to go. Like, so knowing what A is and how changing that and giving an example of surface area, how that can affect energy transmitted via radiation or conduction or any of these. And knowing that, you don't have to know that it's temperature to the 4th power. Like, you don't have to go into that depth. So what about conduction?
Is that the temperature of the organism for radiation? Or is it the temperature of like the radiation specifically? Like
T equals the temperature of the object expressed. So that's going to be it could be the organism. It depends what you're interested in. So if you're interested in the organism, usually
whether it's being given off or.
Yeah, so if there's heat transfer between an organism and an object, you have to know the temperatures of both objects. So you can calculate this radiation for an organism in a rock, say, or a tree or water.
Got it.
So a question from the chat, in other words, number 3 is basically knowing the variables, and number 2 is more explaining how variables change heat flux. Yeah, I'd say that's a good way to put it. They're definitely related. I mean, because it's the same, talking about structure, posture, and I actually forget what the other question was. But if we just just glance through these, like, so this one's a little bit different. So now this has, again, it has surface area, but it has K. What is K? Yeah, it's a form of energy. I mean, the heat flux equation in general, the whole thing is a form of energy too, right? So it's the conductivity, right, specifically. And that depends, and conductivity is just how well that object conducts heat. So, you leave different, this is in T5. So, if you leave 2 objects out in the sun, say a piece of styrofoam and a piece of metal, which one do you think is going to be hotter to the touch?
The metal.
Yeah, and why is that?
Does it have something to do with its density? I don't know. I just know.
Fair enough. And it's because it has greater conductivity. It transfers energy at a more efficiently.
Okay.
So this is the efficiency of energy conduction. Styrofoam doesn't transfer it very well. It preserves it, which is good because then if that's why we have styrofoam boxes for dry ice or regular ice, because it doesn't allow it to conduct out of that environment versus metal wood, it would bleed right through a metal container. Well, it would transfer, not bleed like a liquid. Sorry, that's probably a bad example. And then again, it has surface area, and then it specifically has TB for body temperature. And then TG is like the ground temperature or whatever solid it is. And then how would we describe L? So that's here, right? The distance of heat transfer. And because it's conduction, it has to have, contact, right? So the distance that it has to travel, if you touch a surface area like a stove with your hand, it's going to burn your hand, but it's not going to burn your elbow because that energy is not going to transfer as powerful all the way up to your elbow, but it'll be very powerful at the surface at your hand. That makes sense?
So does that, does that just, what's the point? I guess is what I'm trying to get at. Why do you need to know the distance from, if it's like, so a lizard on a rock, there's no distance between its stomach and the rock. Why would you need to know the distance from it?
But if
its tail wasn't on the rock, you know what I mean? Why?
Fair enough.
Go ahead.
But that's kind of like the stove example. If you want to know how much energy is going to be transferred to the cells or its stomach area, right? That's probably going to be warmer, but it's not going to transfer as efficiently to its back. So you can measure different parts of an organism and how deep that energy goes. So think of depth of energy transfer.
We don't have to do that in this class, do we?
No, you won't have to do
Cool.
calculations with these. It's just by being able to describe the equation that way, and if you change that, how would that affect the equation and what might be a possible outcome?
Okay.
And convection, and we have surface area, body temperature, but now we have TA. And what is TA?
Temperature of the atmosphere? Maybe?
Yeah, so to be more specific, it would be the air and liquid that the organism is in. And then what is H? Simply, it's just the convection coefficient, right? A larger value means a greater heat flux. So, you're not going to need to know it in depth more than that, but just to be aware of what it is, you can almost think of it, but just thinking of how it changes could change the equation, right? Could change the output. So knowing what larger or smaller values mean, it could be important for the exam, but not calculating anything.
What is the coefficient for convection?
What do you mean the coefficient?
Yeah, like what value for like an example, what would the value be? I don't understand.
That's a fair question. I don't numerically, I don't know, to be honest. It's going to depend on the organism. It's going to depend on the object that you're measuring. So just for the exam, what you would need to know is this: larger values mean greater heat flux. So if you have a larger value, if they give you an example, like this has 6 and this one has 2, which one would have a greater energy of convection? Or the one that the value would be 6, or the one that would be 2?
Oh, sorry, it would be greater with 6, right?
Exactly. Yeah. If you have a higher,
so we really just need to understand how the equation works.
Yes.
I mean, and yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's why I said, like, I don't have an example because every organism and every object is going to have a different heat flux or a convection coefficient. Like, so it's going to have a different value depending on what it's made out of. And I don't know a list of convection coefficients offhand. And you don't need to know that, so it's not important. But as far as the exam. All right, then evaporation, we have A again, which is our surface area. What are these EWs and EAs? So we talked about it with evaporation. You have sweat that has to go from a liquid to a gas. And in that energy transformation, that's where the heat is dissipated from the body. That water leaving the body in form of a gas takes heat or energy away or heat away. What does that involve?
Loss of energy. What it says pressure, vapor pressure.
I'm sharing the right screen, right? Like you can see the equation and this right here. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't sharing the other screen. Because I can't see actually what I'm sharing very well. Yeah, so it has to do with vapor pressure, right? So it's just the difference of vapor pressure in the air versus vapor pressure in the body. So these are just the two different vapor pressures. And then what does C stand for?
It's another constant.
Yeah, it's just a constant. So that's, as far as this course doesn't go in depth with these equations or having you calculate stuff. So, and it doesn't specify whether it's higher or lower value matters. So that's something that you won't be asked about, but just knowing that, it's a constant, it's part of the equation. So. All right. Are there any other questions about 2 or 3 from the learning objectives? All right, if not, we can go on to number 4. So this one says, contrast the strategies that freshwater animals and saltwater animals use to osmoregulate. So I guess before we get into the full answer, why don't we break it apart a little bit? If we just focus on osmoregulate, what does that mean briefly? What are we concerned about with these organisms? What are they physically doing?
Is it the fluctuation of like solutes?
Yeah, exactly. So they're moving solvents and solutes around, right?
Mhm.
And how do organisms do that? What are 3 of the most common mechanisms?
They drink it.
Sure.
Yeah, that's one of them.
Yeah, that's getting there. I'm thinking more of think of more on like the molecular level, like what's happening at the molecular level. These are terms that you probably learned in an animal physiology class for sure, and probably in the general biology too. Yeah, so somebody wrote active transport and passive transport. Yeah, those are definitely 2 of the ones that I'm thinking of. And there's one more that I was thinking of. I made a movie about it in the 90s, I think, or early 2000s. And Chris Rock was the voice. Yeah, Osmosis. The movie's Osmosis Jones, if anybody's heard of that. But yeah, so osmosis, passive transport, and active transport are the three primary ways that organisms move solvents in and out of the body. Now, if we want to, let's break it down further and let's just talk about freshwater animals. So there was an example I know with freshwater fish. So, and somebody mentioned that they drink water, right? And what happens when a freshwater fish drinks water? What happens to the solvents in their body, or the level of solvents? Yeah, they get diluted, right? So a fish takes in water and it dilutes the amount of solvents that they have in their body. How do they get back to homeostasis? How can they get rid of some of that water that they drank in?
Through their urine?
Yeah, they can excrete it, right? Through their waste. Exactly. How can they gain solvents too? What else do fish do? They drink water and
They eat.
yeah, and they eat other fish or other organisms, and those have solvents, so they absorb another organism's solvents. What are some of the organs that these organisms, or that fish, if we want to stay in this example, use to affect ion levels or solvent levels? Yeah, kidneys, right? That's a great example. What do the kidneys do? Do they add ions or remove ions from their urine? Yeah, exactly. They remove them. What does that do when they remove the ions from their urine? Where do they go?
In the urine, right?
Well,
Or they excrete it.
if they remove them from the urine, they reabsorb them, right? So it's a way of retaining some ions and not just urinating out all the ions that you take in. What happens, what can organisms do if they're dehydrated?
Drink more water, or I mean, do they just keep in that they preserve the water instead
Yeah,
of
so
excreting it? I don't know if fish do that.
it's the same train of thought, but kind of the opposite, right? So we can also absorb water back from our urine that's in our bladder. So humans can definitely do this. And that can cause us, to keep a little bit of water in our system. What about saltwater animals? Do they have the same problem as freshwater fish?
They absorb more ions, right?
Yeah, so to link these together, freshwater fish have a problem of diluting themselves because they're surrounded by fresh water that they drink in, where saltwater fish have a problem of having too many ions or solutes or solvents in their body because they're in, salt water, right? So how do saltwater animals, deal with this? I think the book talked about whales, sardines, and plankton. Do these animals drink water too?
Yes.
So if they drink in a lot of water, they also drink in a lot of salt, right?
Yes.
What do they do with that water that they drink in?
The same thing. They excrete the, well, they I mean, they use their kidneys the same way. but they probably keep in more water than, I mean, they can do that, right? They keep in more water than the ions or whatever instead.
Yeah, so they don't absorb as many solutes. The kidneys don't pull in the ions like they do in freshwater fish. They let more of the ions pass through the urine.
Yeah.
What are some other byproducts that some aquatic vertebrates excrete through their waste? So there's a question in the chat about. So in saltwater fish, the kidneys are going to absorb fewer solvents or fewer ions and allow more to pass through the waste to get those excess solvents out of the body. Whereas in freshwater fish, because they constantly breathe or drink in fresh water, they're diluting themselves. The kidneys are going to work to absorb more solvents and keep it in the body and let more water pass through the waste. But as we go back to one of the examples in cogbooks, is the waste that these animals produce in the saltwater always the same? What do sharks produce in addition to urine? Does anybody remember that example? Yeah, ammonia, exactly, right? So there's a little bit more, there's different chemical processes going on. Whereas terrestrial vertebrates, what do they typically, they convert ammonia into a different product. Does anybody remember what that is? Yeah, they convert ammonia into urea. Yeah, so the key for this is you might get a question that says compare and contrast some of the physiological processes of freshwater versus saltwater animals. So knowing how the kidneys work in the two different systems, knowing what the challenges that they face are different, are going to be important. Do you have a question?
Where was the shark example? I don't remember that part. Maybe I just cruised past it.
We would be in, this would be in T module 6, T2.
And you said it would be the difference between saltwater and freshwater, or did you say terrestrial? And okay.
Well, what we've just been talking about were, this is for adaptations to saltwater animals and then adaptations to freshwater animals. So it would be aquatic animals, the examples we've been talking about. And the shark example would be in adaptations of saltwater animals. It's like the middle section of module 6. Yes, thank you. In the chat, they have it too. Are there any more questions or comments about contrasting the strategies that freshwater animals and saltwater animals use to osmoregulate? All right, not, we can go on to number 5. And that one says, where is it? Describe the challenge that aquatic plants face when acquiring carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So what do plants need to survive? CO2, from the chat. Yeah, and what I was getting at, already beat me to it, is this is going to have to do with CO2 transfer. And one of the challenges that aquatic plants face is that CO2 diffuses very slowly through the water. So if these plants are semi-aquatic or they're aquatic at base, but they have leaves and flowers above the water, they have, those plants have an advantage because above the water, they can absorb more CO2 more rapidly than they can below the water. But not all plants are above the water. Some are fully submerged. So those plants face a little bit more of a challenge because, as has been said, CO2 diffuses slowly through water. So what do they do to get CO2 if they're fully underwater, or if not enough of it is above water to get CO2? This is related to they pull in other molecules from the water, and if they pull in certain molecules from the water, what do they do with those molecules? So the question is, does this have to do with the boundary layer? Not in this specific question, no. But the answer then it becomes, yeah, so they can use like carbon, CO2 that goes into the water often gets converted into carbonic acid. And then plants can absorb this carbonic acid and they can break that down and take some of that CO2. So they can get direct CO2 and they can take in other molecules such as carbonic acid, break those down and get CO2 that way. So they have multiple routes of absorbing CO2, but there's a little bit of chemistry involved where they have to break certain molecules down in order to get anything that's not pure CO2. That makes sense? The section wasn't very long with the aquatic plants, but I think that was the main takeaways I got from it, is how they deal with the CO2 problem. Yeah, so that's a great way to put it in the chat. It says, to get CO2, the aquatic plants under the water absorbs the carbonic acid that is made from when CO2 combines with water, which breaks down molecules and gives them CO2 other than pure CO2. Yeah, so they can, yeah, so, and then they have two routes, pure CO2 or other molecules they break apart and take out the CO2. Exactly. All right, how about number 6 then? That says, explain how countercurrent blood flow enhances the diffusion of oxygen in the gills of aquatic animals. Actually, it says explain how, no, never mind. But there are two types of blood flow, right? There's countercurrent and there's concurrent. Why don't we talk about the difference of those two first?
The concurrent is two fluids moving in the same direction, and countercurrent is when they're moving in opposite directions.
Exactly, yep. And then if we go back to the specific question, it says, explain how countercurrent blood flow enhances the diffusion of oxygen. So why is countercurrent blood flow essentially better than concurrent blood flow? Let's take a look at this visually, right? So up here, we have concurrent blood flow, where we have the water in the middle, and this is going through the gills of the fish, and then we have blood flow going all to the right. What do we notice? If water flow, if it enters here, do we have high levels of oxygen when water enters the gills? Right, yes, it's 100%, right? And then we have low levels of oxygen at the gills, and like we talked about with energy, physical states want to be in equilibrium, so oxygen is going to go into places where it is at lower levels, so it's going to go into the blood here. So 100% versus 20%. So oxygen in the water is going to go down until it equilibrates with oxygen in the blood, and when they're all at 50%, there's no more oxygen transfer because they're going in the same direction. It holds 50%. But now if we look at the opposite here, we have water coming in and going against the blood flow in the gills and countercurrent exchange. So when it enters, it's at 100%. In the gills, it's pretty high, it's at 90%, but it's still below it. So it's still going to dissipate some, and it's going to take it out of the water and put it into the gills. But as long as it's continuously going against each other, you're always going to have this higher rate where it can, instead of being 50%, it can be upwards of 100%. It can be fully saturated in countercurrent, where it can only be half saturated in concurrent blood flow. Because you're always going to be bringing in 100% water that's going against lower levels of blood. And as the lower levels of blood are going to continue to go up and take that oxygen out of that blood. So somebody want to put into words, I guess, to answer the question, how countercurrent blood flow enhances the diffusion of oxygen in the gills of aquatic animals? So it has to do with region of contact, right? There's certain regions in concurrent blood flow that are the same. So there's certain regions of the blood flow where there's no more oxygen exchange because it's saturated to the level of the water. But in countercurrent, there's always going to be a difference. So there's a continuous flow of oxygen at all regions of countercurrent. So it's continuously bringing oxygen. So collectively, it brings in more oxygen because it covers more for the same amount of surface area. It brings oxygen in everywhere rather than just parts of it. That makes sense?
I think I'm having a hard time with this one. I don't know why. But back to on the picture, I took a little snapshot of it, but the flow of water in concurrent flow, yeah, is going in the same direction as the blood.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does the blood flow percentages, like how is, I guess, how is that shown in the fish? Like, how does that work? I don't know. Is that how much of the oxygen it's receiving from the water flow?
No, that's how much oxygen it has at that location. So
Okay.
here, for example, there's the water, when it enters, it has 100% oxygen, and it's hitting a region of blood flow on the gill, so the capillaries, where it only has 20%. So it's going to want to, where it's at high levels, want to go to low levels. So that's why this now moves in the next region, it's up to 30%. And it's next to the water here that is 70%, but it's still higher. So it's going to give more of that. So then it moves up to 40 and it depletes this to 60. But that's still
okay.
high.
And that's why when you said 50-50, it just pretty much stops because it's even on both ends.
Yeah, and these arrows right here
okay.
indicate where oxygen is moving. So at these locations, oxygen is going from the water to the blood flow, so to the capillaries. But then now in this whole region over here to the right, it's equal, so there's no more oxygen being transferred,
Moving.
and it then leaves the gills. So remember, water comes in through the gills and leaves through the gills on the other side. It's not in there very long, but it's, you know, half of it.
Oh, okay. Now I'm getting it.
and half
Okay.
of
And then in counter current, it's always less than the water flow. So there's never really like a point of it stopping.
Yeah,
That's why it's continuous. Okay. Now I get it.
the fish
Thank
is-
you.
it's getting more of a benefit because there's
Yeah.
arrows. So at every stage that the water is in the fish, it's giving the fish oxygen.
Okay. Now that makes sense. Great. Thank you.
No problem. This is not a real easy topic. And then from the chat, it says countercurrent blood flow enhances diffusion of oxygen in the gills because of the region of contact. Exactly. Countercurrent has a continuous bringing of oxygen rather than concurrent, where it can reach equilibrium, max out at 50% saturation. Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, are there any other questions about countercurrent blood flow and how it's beneficial to organisms? All right. That might be a good one to go back and review, but I think we maybe have the general idea of it for right now. All right, so number 7, given a relationship between a phenotype and fitness, identify the mode of selection, being directional, stabilizing, or disruptive. So why don't we describe these? What is stabilizing selection in words? In relation to a phenotype and the fitness of an organism. One says, someone in the chat said favors heterozygotes. What do you mean by that? You want to maybe go in a little more detail? So moderate traits, not extremes. I would agree with that, right? So it's going to favor phenotypes that are intermediate. So that's where the highest survival is and reproductive success. And on the edges, the extremes, you're going to have the lowest fitness. So what about directional selection? So that, and the chat says favors one extreme trait over another. I would agree with that mostly. It could end, I mean, yeah, that could be correct. It could end up in one side over the other. So the other answer in the chat says occurs when extreme phenotype experiences higher fitness than the average phenotype of the population. Yeah, I would agree. So when it goes to the edges, it could either be both edges or it could be one, could be higher than the other. So away from the middle. So kind of opposite of what we were just talking about, right? And then what about the third one? What is disruptive selection?
Is that favoring both extremes?
Yeah, sorry, I misexplained that previously. Yeah, so directional selection is in the name, it's a direction, it is one direction.
No, one
And
way or
disruptive
another.
selection could be either. Sorry. That was my mistake. Why don't we look at some examples of this to make sure that we're clear? So I'm going to share my screen again. All right, can we see these, the activity here?
Yes.
Okay, so what would this first one be? We have relative fitness on the y-axis and phenotypic value on the x-axis. So what are we trying to maximize in these?
The relative fitness.
Yeah, we always want to have a relative fitness as high, value of 1, as close to it as we can be. So what would this type of selection be?
Negative directional. Because it's getting smaller towards the end, right?
But what would be favored?
What's favored?
Yeah, so if we think, if we said we want the highest value here, where are the dots? I definitely agree that it's directional.
Is it the opposite and positive directional?
Oh no, you said negative? Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh man, you're gonna mess me up on my exam now. I'll be all backwards.
I hope not, no, because I'm struggling with this right now. Apologize. But yeah, so this I would argue is negative directional, right? What about the one down here?
Stabilizing.
Because it's an intermediate trait, right in the middle?
Yes, and you didn't say it was because it's heterozygous, did you? I heard that come out, but I didn't catch the whole sentence. It's not because it's heterozygous, right? I don't think so. I think it's like
in the chat.
It's
Somebody made a comment, I think favors extreme traits, but that was related to what we're talking about.
I think stabilizing is like, think of a tail being long versus short, and you want it to be intermediate. You don't want it to be too long to like trip you up or whatever, but you don't want it to be too short because you can't balance as well. So the middle, like a medium length would be, is that what that's supposed to be?
For stabilizing?
Phenotypic. Yeah.
Yeah, you want an intermediate phenotypic value. So kind of like a bell curve.
It doesn't have anything to do with the alleles though. Homozygous or heterozygous, right? No.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay.
What was the comment in the chat? I think it was both. What is that considering? I mean, I agree. Yes, alleles do affect phenotypes because alleles make up the phenotype, and the phenotype is what we observe. But what do you, I guess, what is in the chat? What do you mean by, I think it's both? Both what? Sorry.
Like the stabilizing can be both, I think.
Oh, it's both intermediate alleles and phenotypes? Okay, then yeah, I would agree. I follow now. Thank you. Now, what is this one up in the top right? We want to continue. Yeah, positive directional selection, right? Because here, as the phenotypic value increases, so does the fitness. And with negative, as the phenotypic value increases, fitness decreases. Because we always read these charts left to right. So remember that when reading these for the exam, because you will see, I think there's a question in the chat where, do we need to know the shapes of the graphs? The answer to that is, in terms of these types of graphs, yes, you'll have to look at a figure like this, and you'll have to tell if it's, what type of selection it is. And then this last one, what is this one? What type of selection? Yeah, this would be the disruptive selection, right? Let's make sure that I'm correct in what we did. All right, yes. So according to cogbooks, now we understand why this is negative, why this is positive, and stabilizing and disruptive. Yeah, are there any more questions on identifying the types of selection? And we're clear, right, that if we're going to read the chart, we start with the low phenotypic value. We say, as we increase phenotypic value, what happens to fitness? So in here, as we increase it, the dots go down. So this would be a negative pattern, right? And then as we increase this one, this would be a positive pattern. The dots go up. And as we increase here, they initially go up, they peak, and then they come down. So this would be, they stabilize in intermediate phenotypic value. And this one, start high, go low, and then go high. So it's disruptive because they would want to go towards the extreme traits for disruptive. All right. We're pretty good on that question. So number 8 says, given a relationship between a phenotype and fitness, identify the optimal phenotype. So this is going to be related to some of the activities in Cogbooks too. And really we want to look at is where fitness is the greatest. Why don't we take a look at one of these activities too? Because this involves, doesn't really involve math, but it involves looking at the numbers in more detail. Okay, so if our goal again is to find the greatest level of fitness, and now we want to ask what is the optimal phenotype value, where is fitness, going to be the highest in A in relation to the x-axis, because that's our phenotypic value. So this, someone in the chat said 0, right? Because if we look, the dots are the highest on this side, and if we go down, that's 0. So I would agree. What about in B? What numeric value of the phenotypic or the phenotype would be the highest fitness? 19, someone said in the chat, right? Yeah, I would agree. These are the highest points. It's going to be 19, or maybe greater than 19. But that's based on our choices, I would agree. And then how about here? What value do we get for a phenotype here? So 22, so somewhere in the middle. Yeah, I'd say 20 something. 22 seems reasonable. And then what about here? Why is this one greater than 50 and not 0?
Because it continues, the relative fitness keeps getting greater and greater. It doesn't stop, right?
Well,
It just keeps
say
going.
we have a data set. We don't know if it goes off the chart. Let's just assume that these are all the data that we have.
Okay.
So somebody in the chat said because it is higher on the right. Yeah, so these dots on the right, they're just the highest, right? These are pretty high, but it's at about 80% fitness, and these dots are at 100% fitness. So just by value, the right side is higher. So being on this extreme would be have a higher phenotypic value, would have higher fitness, or phenotypic value of 50 or more. All right, does that make sense with these activities on how to determine the optimal phenotype? Okay, cool. All right, so I think we can move on to number 9 then. So this says, describe how natural selection, genetic drift, migration, and mutation contribute to the evolution of a population. So why don't we maybe just break these down and talk about them one at a time. Let's talk about natural selection. How does that contribute to the evolution of a population?
Species typically mate with individuals that have higher fitness.
That's a form of, yeah, that would be sexual selection, which is within natural selection, right? Let's think, they can take a step back. What happens to traits under natural selection? So in the chat it says the least fit organisms will die out, and then someone said they change. Yeah, so it is related to those comments, I would agree. So if the least fit organisms die out, what happens to their genes?
They die out.
Yeah, another way to word it would be the genes are selected against in some way, and they don't pass their genes on, right?
Right.
So it selects for certain genes that are related to what multiple people have said, the genes that enhance fitness are typically selected for, and those are passed on, right? And that could change based on those genes that are selected for. It could be based on any number of like phenotypes we talked about. It could be body color, or it could be eye color, it could be, you know, the size of a deer's antler might get selected for. So those that are in the chat, it says those that are favorable to the environment will pass down genes causing evolutionary change. Yeah, so if the environment changes, you know, there might be certain traits that are favorable. They say it gets warmer under maybe the climate change scenario. So animals that can deal with heat better are more likely to survive and pass their genes on than animals that are not able to deal with heat. But if the environment changes again and we go into an ice age, we might shift where animals that can deal with cold. So maybe animals that are larger and have more volume to surface area, you have thicker hair, thicker fur, or feathers, those types of traits are going to be passed on. So natural selection, again, like as some people said, it's going to be the genes that favor fitness in the current environment are going to be selected for and passed on, but it can change over time, and different traits could be selected for if the environmental conditions change. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so simply put, favorable traits are favored and passed on that meet the conditions of the environment. All right, what about genetic drift? How does that contribute to the evolution of a population? Somebody said introduces new genes. You may want to elaborate a little bit on that. How would they introduce new genes, or how would this mechanism introduce new genes? I think that might be more related to the next one, the migration. What generally has to happen for genetic drift to occur?
Small populations and like random events. I think about like the peppered moth, when like industrials, all the what is it called? I can't. Like the moths changed their genetic variation because, you know, the darker moth could blend in better with the is it coal? I want to say it's coal, but I can't remember specifically what it was that mankind was doing that was causing the species to evolve in that direction. But it was due to genetic drift.
That's an example from cogbooks, and that was pollution that was coming from, it might have been a coal or plant or some sort of factory,
Like
but they were basically getting covered in soot, and it changed their camouflage, right? So the ones that there originally were a white moth that blended in on white trees, but because the soot polluted the forest, the darker phenotype were surviving better because they were being eaten less by predators. So it was enhancing their fitness to be darker, and then those genes survived and passed on. So it actually changed the population's phenotype to be more of a dark colored population. But I don't think that would fit under genetic drift. That would fit more.
No, it sounds more like natural. Yeah, dang it.
Okay, but if getting back to genetic drift, so yeah, so some people put in the comments here, random change in allele. simply put, the way I think of it is it's a chance, it generally happens under a chance event. So a good example are like storms. If you have some bird population on the mainland and a subpopulation gets blown out to an island and they can't get back, now you have a small subsample of that population that is going to evolve under new environmental conditions. Another example could be you have, a forest fire and some animals survive, but that old growth forest is now decimated, it's gone. It's more of a grassland and a shrubland now, but a small population of rabbits, say, survive that. Now they're going to have a small variation of genetic makeup, and they're going to evolve to live in that new environment. So a chance event, such as weather, is also often a good example of this, where a subsample of a population evolves under new environmental conditions. Does that make sense, or does anybody have anything they want to add to genetic drift? And somebody mentioned variation is lost, and generally with genetic drift, they run into the chances of being bottlenecked, right? Because they do have, very small, it's a subsample of the population, so variation is lost. And if they don't have the variation to survive in that new environment or survive, enough variety to survive disease or something, that population can be lost to that environment pretty easily. But if genetic drift occurs, they will survive. All right, so the next one, migration. Let's talk about that one a little bit. Migration is the movement of alleles from one population to another. Yeah, because you have two separate populations and you have now mixing of those populations. Do we think that increases genetic diversity or decreases genetic diversity? So we have an increases and increases with a question mark. So I would argue that initially you could increase some genetic diversity, but ultimately long-term, if that migration keeps up, you're going to actually lose genetic diversity because you're going to have two, let's call them two distinct populations that have different, they're same species, but different genetic makeups in some sense because they've evolved in different environments. And now if they mix, they're going to homogenize their alleles and they're actually going to lose genetic diversity. What does this do what does homogenization of a population do? Will it speed up or slow down evolutionary changes? Right, it'll slow it down because they won't, it'll keep pulling from the extremes and homogenizing them to more of an intermediate. What about the last one then, mutation? So chat says mutation is the addition of genetic variation due to mutation in genes. Yeah, I think that's along the lines of how to describe mutation. So a random modified gene. Are they always selected for, or always selected against, or? No, it could be no change even. What do you mean by no change? So it depends what it codes for. Silent mutations are possible. I agree with where you're going with this. I guess where I was trying to go a little bit is what would the mutation have to cause to be selected for or against? why would a mutation, maybe if we think of it singly, why would a mutation, if a mutation occurred, what potentially would it have to do to cause it to be selected for?
Survive.
Yeah, so it would have to increase survival, right? Yeah, exactly. A favorable change, increased fitness. Yeah. So if a mutation occurs and it increases fitness, it'll likely be selected against, or it'll likely be selected for. If a mutation occurs and it decreases fitness and survival, it will be selected against. But generally, you can think of them as kind of a randomly modified gene. All right.
Could that speed up evolution then,
Yeah.
depending on the mutation? So it could do both.
Yeah, I would argue that if it's selected for, it could speed up evolution. If it's selected against, it might, be neutral or slow down evolution.
For natural selection and genetic drift, I don't know if I caught it, but I'm guessing natural selection evolution will just stay the same, right? Because it's natural. It's not because it's selecting for greater fitness. So would evolution be sped up in that case? You're saying speed up and slow down, so I'm thinking it's one or the other.
Yeah, natural selection is going to depend on the selection pressure. So in terms of speed, I wouldn't say that natural selection, it definitely, if a natural selection occurs, that means that there's a change happening. So it goes from no evolutionary change to some evolutionary change. So in general, natural selection, if it's acting, will speed up evolution. And I know we talked about all of these independently, but remember too that a lot of times multiple of these mechanisms are happening at once or simultaneously. So it's not always just one mechanism happening on a population. Are we good with number 9, we think, or you want to talk about it a little bit more?
I feel good about it.
Okay, we got a couple goods. You can always, email me or put something in discussion on the discussion board if we ever want to go back to these. Number 10, given information about the environmental conditions and the mean phenotype of populations, determine whether phenotypes resulted from natural selection or genetic drift. This one, I believe, is from some of the activities we had. Anybody know what, I don't know if they got rid of this one and forgot to get rid of this question, but I'm having a hard time finding this in Cogbooks. Sometimes they update cogbooks from semester to semester.
I don't remember an activity that was related to this.
So why don't we put a pin in this one? And I will go back again and look for this more. And I'll contact cogbooks about it too. Because this is something that I could not find this semester. I think they must have removed that content or replaced it with something. And we'll readdress that on Monday, and I'll make an announcement about it too if I find it, just to make sure we're all on the same page. But this might be one of the errors that's in cogbooks. All right, so okay, why don't we go ahead then and go to 11. And this one says describe the. So the question is, will we have another office hour on Monday or just an announcement? I'll do an office hour on Monday. It'll be in the evening again. And I'll make an announcement about that. Because you guys have the exam on Tuesday, I know. And I know Monday is a holiday, but for those that can attend, and if not, we'll have a video of it. All right, so number 11, describe the phenotypes that constitute an organism's life history. So how do we describe life history? If we had to define that first, how would we define that? What characteristics about an organism go into its life history? Someone said traits that define an organism's life cycle. Yeah, definitely on the right track. So growth, development, reproduction, survival, reproduction size, etc. Yeah, so the way I describe it is the schedule of an organism's growth, development, reproduction, and survival. So all things that encapsulate, its life cycle, as well as and what's within that life cycle then, right? Because you talk about a life cycle, I think like an egg to an adult stage. So what are some of the phenotypes within that? So we said reproduction and size. What about those? What about reproduction? And what about size?
Parental investment, was that one of them?
Yeah, level of parental care is one. So if we think about size, so number of offspring produced, that's another one. So if we think of reproduction, what's important for that? Size at sexual maturity, age at sexual maturity. Are all life cycles the same duration across organisms? Yeah, so no, right? So does longevity or lifespan, right? It's going to change based on the organism that we're talking about. Do all organisms have the same number of reproductive events in their life? Yeah, again, also number of reproductive events is related to an organism's life history. Yeah, so I think we hit them all, but I'll just recap the ones I've pulled out of cogbook. So size at sexual maturity, age at sexual maturity, number of reproductive events, longevity or lifespan, number of offspring produced, size of offspring, and level of parental care. What is an advantage of growing to a large size to reach sexual maturity?
You can have larger offspring.
Yeah, you could potentially have larger offspring.
Or more offspring.
Yeah, either or. That's in terms of like the female. maybe what's a benefit for a male being large at the time of sexual maturity? From the chat, you can invest more in your own fitness. Well, your fitness is 0 until you reproduce, right? Yeah, so size, if a female selects for a larger mates, you know, being larger at sexual maturity would be a benefit you might get selected for. So going back to, you can invest in your own fitness at, well, you can invest in your own fitness at first. I would agree with that. You're likely to survive if you make it to a larger size. The larger you get, the less predators you have, right? So you're able to invest more in reproduction during the reproductive season and worry less about predators potentially. What would be a disadvantage to having to grow to a large size to reach sexual maturity?
More energy?
Yeah, you would have to invest more energy into your survival, right? Generally, does it take more time to reach a larger size? Yeah, not as much time to reproduce, right? So that's a big chunk of your life that you invested in growth and survival, but you don't have, you know, you maybe have less reproductive occurrences in your life, which could lead to potentially less offspring produced based on if your RK selected. Yeah, so the way I would think about these is like, what would be a benefit and what would be, you know, a negative to each of these traits? You know, if it takes a while to reach a large size or for sexual maturity, you know, you also run the risk of catching disease and dying because you're not reproducing, you're just living. You know, you run the risk of being eaten by a predator potentially. You know, you increase your risk of dying in a natural disaster such as a storm. And larger animals have longer gestational periods as well. Yeah, so the longer gestational period you have, the more, you know, the higher the probability of, you know, reaching a complication just based on the duration. Maybe one more example would be, you know, a benefit to having high levels of parental care. So in the chat it says offspring may live longer or make it to sexual maturity. Why would offspring live longer if you have high levels of parental care? Yeah, exactly. They get more resources from their parents. They, you know, including safety. Some of the resources could be food and shelter, so they're protected, right? So it does. I would agree that high parental investment increases the survival of their offspring. But what would be a negative to high levels of parental care?
The parents' energy is being expended.
Yeah, so it costs the parents more energy for sure. So the parents will likely not reproduce again at that time. Yeah, so if you think in terms of birds, right? It's hard to have multiple nests to take care of simultaneously, right? If you put all your investment in one nest, you know, you increase the odds of those individuals being healthier, larger, and, you know, surviving. But if it gets wiped out by a predator, you don't have any, you know, backup, you know, offspring. So you lose that entire nesting opportunity. Yeah, so all of these can be a positive and they can all be, you know, negatives as well. There's, you know, it's that balance that these organisms have to find in order to maximize their fitness. Any other questions or comments about these life history traits? not, we can move on to number 12. This one says, use the principle of allocation to explain trade-offs between phenotypes that constitutes an organism's life history, which I think we've pretty much just covered with those examples, unless somebody wants to add another example or has questions about a possible example. So a couple examples that I have here in my notes are things we've already said. So larger body size can allow for either larger offspring or more offspring. And then a longer lifespan allows for later maturity and likely larger size, which can make an organism less vulnerable to predators, more attractive to mates, make them a stronger competitor, and allow for larger offspring or more offspring again. So we covered a lot of the examples in 11. I kind of jumped the gun, sorry. But it works. So we can move to number 13 then, I think. So this says, list the phenotypes that characterize organisms at each end of the slow-fast continuum of life histories. So why don't we start with slow? So what are some of the traits or phenotypes that these slow continuum organisms possess? This kind of builds off of 11 and 12 too. What would be an example of an animal at the slow end of this continuum for life history traits? In the chat, an elephant. Yep, that's a great example. So, you know, an albatross would be another one, giant tortoise, oak trees, doesn't have to be animals, it's plants too. Humans, I would argue, are the same. Yep. So if we think of knowing what some of those examples are now, what are some of those traits that they have? Do these animals typically have high or low parental investment?
High?
Yeah, so high parental investment, long lifespan, someone in the chat said, longer time to reach maturity. Yeah, exactly. So this is just specifying this with examples and, you know, knowing slow or fast. What about, so then fast would be the opposite, right? But I guess what would be some examples of those types of organisms? Yeah, fruit flies is an example from Cog books. We might think of plants, you know, the faster growing weedy plants or herbaceous plants. And then their traits would just be the opposite, right? You know, they have a short time to sexual maturity, typically have a high number of offspring, little to no parental investment, and short lifespans. And they're generally smaller, right? That covers number 13 pretty well. All right, number 14 says, predict how environmental conditions will affect patterns of growth and reproduction. So what are some things from the environment that can affect patterns of growth and reproduction? Somebody said resources. Yep.
Climate change.
How so? So type of resource would be space. Yep. But how would, so if, take that example, how would space affect an organism's life history? Maybe another example would be food, right? That's another resource. How would food affect an organism's life history?
More competition.
Yeah, so if resources are rare, it could lead to competition. But how does that relate to the life history traits we've been talking about? Or a lot of those have to do with reproduction.
They're likely to have less offspring because they don't have enough resources to feed more than like feed themselves and their offspring.
Yeah, so maybe they can't, yeah, exactly. They can't invest as much into their offspring. So it might reduce parental care, right? Because if they can't take care of their offspring, they can't feed them. They might not try as much because they don't have the energy to feed themselves. It could also affect an organism's mass and age, maybe at reproduction, right? You know, if they're supposed to be sexually reproductive at this age and large, but there's not a lot of food resources around, maybe they're smaller at age of reproduction. What about organisms that go through metamorphosis? Are those always consistent? This relates to what we're talking about. I mean, those are timing events that have to do with the amount of resources required to reach the next life stage. So if they didn't get enough resources, it might take them longer to go through metamorphosis, or they might miss a season and not actually emerge and emerge in the following season if they don't complete have the requirements necessary for that life cycle event. What about abiotic conditions? How could those affect life histories? What changes happen? I'm sorry, go ahead. What changes do we see throughout seasons in the abiotic parts of the environment? Temperature, right? Yeah, exactly. So temperature can be used as a cue to animals to complete certain events, maybe to go into hibernation. Sunlight is another great environmental cue for animals. It can affect other life events such as the start of breeding season, right? If animals rely on temperature changes and or photoperiod changes, it could affect how long these reproductive or breeding seasons are. So I think this affects a lot of timing events for organisms, these abiotic conditions. Some other events that it could affect would be maybe migration, right? Or even the physiology of the organism. If they're waiting on seasonal changes to start their reproductive cycle, if these like photoperiod or temperature changes, it might change when these organisms go into the reproductive cycle. What do organisms have to worry about in their environment other than resources and mates? Yeah, predators. That's another example from cog books. Predators affect their life history, but I would ask, how so?
Shorten their lifespans. They may not meet sexual maturity and reproduce if there are more predators.
Yeah, it can definitely affect them that way. Remember some of the examples from cog books? They actually had some experiments where they exposed, I think it was these frogs to predators, or just the cue of the predator when they were eggs. Not even they didn't eat them, but just the scent of the predator. Yeah. And it affected their hatching rates, right? It affected their time and size at metamorphosis. and even affected their time and size at sexual maturity. Just these indirect predator effects.
And that's genetic, like, what cue is that? How do they know?
I think it was a physiological response because their body recognized the scent of the predator and it changed some of their physiologies. It sped up processes or it slowed them down in some cases, depending on the example. So I think in some of the other examples, predators can, they often cause some organisms to become sexually mature at later stages in their life where they're larger. Because if they're picking off smaller ones, the larger ones that survive and become sexually mature later survive. This would be a form of natural selection, right? That it could cause, through natural selection, could cause the organisms to mature larger so that they don't have to worry about the predators as much. And they might even lose the predator if they become bigger than that predator, or they can fend it off. And then the last example that Cogbooks kind of talked about was the number of offspring. And we talked about this a little bit, but it still fits within this section. So it says more offspring means worse parental care, right? Generally. Yeah, so as they increase the number of offspring, their efforts of parental care get divided into smaller amounts to each individual offspring.
What kind of environment would produce that? We're still on 14, right? I stepped away for a second. Okay, yeah.
I think this one would be related to the resources. So if you have an environment that is very heavy in resources, the parents might invest and have more offspring, but say those resources get depleted, maybe you're in the prairie and there's a fire that wipes out a bunch of insects that these birds were eating their offspring.
Okay.
And these could be carryover effects because there's other organisms. I think one of the examples is maybe about elk that said a previous year. So these are animals that have multiple reproductive events in their life. If they have a really good spring where they get tons of resources and build up good reserves, but then have a very harsh winter, their body might invest and have twins or triplets, but then a really harsh winter, a change in the environment, that more offspring could have a negative impact on the mother or themselves when they're born into the following spring. So the key ones that Cogbooks covered, remember, are predators, resources, abiotic conditions, and the number of offspring. And again, like most things in biology or ecology, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, even though we kind of talked about them individually. You can have these, the abiotic conditions can affect the number of offspring even from year to year within a season, or the amount of resources interact with the number of predators, kind of vice versa. Are there any more questions about how environmental conditions can affect the patterns of growth and reproduction in organisms? All right. If not, we can go to number 15. So this one says, given a relationship between an offspring's energy and its survival, predict the optimal amount of energy that a parent should invest in each offspring. So this is like the example we did towards the beginning of this session, where it's that plot with the curve. You look for the tangent line, or you draw the tangent line at the inflection point, and that would be the optimal point. And you can divide the energy available across the energy output to get either the optimal number of offspring or to get the optimal amount of energy that should be invested into each offspring. So it just depends on what information you're given in the question. Do we want to go over that example again, or are we feeling good about that? Or yeah, 15, there's a couple examples. and it's either going to ask you for the optimal number of offspring or the optimal amount of energy to be invested in each offspring. And you'll be given a couple of the pieces, like either saying if she has 5 offspring and has this much energy, how much energy should she invest into each offspring? Or you'll get a question like we went over, if she has this much energy and invests this much energy per offspring, how many offspring should she have? Sure. So we can go over an example. Let me find it in Calbooks real quick. Okay, so it's one of these activities. There'll be, so this is in T8 and it'll be under the activities. There's 4 of them right here, right? So this is a different one than we did earlier. So if she has 1,000 kilojoules of energy, how many offspring of the optimal size could she produce? So remember, we want to find that inflection point, which is probably going to be, you know, somewhere in this general range. And we have a, so we draw a line down, call it maybe 100. If we have 1,000 to start with, and each one should get, so this is energy invested per offspring, so how much she should invest into each offspring. We do 1,000 divided by 100, and then this one should have 10 offspring. I think, take a look at some of the other examples if they have a flip of that. This is again, which of the following clutch sizes would be closest to optimum? Yeah, so these are the 4 activities and the questions and the figures that number 15 is referring to. That's correct. Okay, we're feeling good about that. And move on to the last one, number 16. So this one says, given the energy available for reproduction, use a model to predict the optimal number of offspring. That's exactly what number 15 is. Oh, they're just inverse. Okay, my bad. They're just inverse of each other. So this number 16 is the optimal number of offspring, and this one is predict the optimal amount of energy that she should invest in each offspring. So those are those activities. They're just slightly different questions. Is everybody clear on what the difference is between 15 and 16? Just the number of offspring or the amount of energy per offspring? Yeah, it'll be the same graphs, but it's just asking, it'll give you different pieces of information. So either it'll tell you like how many offspring can she have given this much energy, or if she had this many offspring and this much energy, what's the optimal amount of energy to invest per offspring? You solve them, yeah, the math is going to be the same. It's just the order that you plug in the different the variables. It's going to depend on what you divide into the initial energy available. Yeah, you'll solve them the same way, but your answer will either be an amount of energy or a number of offspring. And it's all going to stem from the amount of energy she has to begin with. And she wants to divide it evenly and have the most offspring she can. There's not, honestly, there's no key with the learning objectives. I just have my own personal notes that I took when I went through the cog books. You know, I'd be happy to go over any of the questions a second time if somebody wants to, or if anybody wants to send me an email with an answer that they think that they have and want me to comment on, I'd be happy to do it that way too. Okay, and that covers all the questions from the learning objectives. You know, if there's any other questions that anybody has or anything, you know, let me know, or we could call it a session. All right. With that, thank you for everybody for coming and participating. You know, again, I'm sure your classmates that weren't able to make it, well, if they watch this, will appreciate you for doing that. And I will make an announcement about the exact time of my office hours in the near future for Monday. I will see you then. Have a good night.